Good morning. Can you hear me? Even though we're still missing one of our panelists, I think that we will begin. And it's a great pleasure to open up our first panel of our conference after such insightful morning welcoming remarks. And I very much wanted to thank the UN office in Geneva and the Nizami Ganjavi International Center for organizing the conference on peace, justice, diversity, and the SDGs. Our panel today is on peace and security in a changing world. And indeed, while we have so many other crucial issues to discuss on our agenda, without security, it's impossible for societies to work to resolve these problems of diversity, gender, climate, to pursue adequate policies in education and health. And indeed, all of these issues are exacerbated by war, conflict, displacement, and refugees. I come from Ukraine, and we feel this very acutely there. We're in our 8th year of a war with 15,000 dead and 2 million displaced. And indeed, the post-World War II order, when nations came together to guarantee inviolable borders and peace, was upended by the invasion in 2008 of Georgia and then in 2014 of Ukraine. And we've witnessed in our part of the world not only a violation of our borders, but a new kind of warfare, the hybrid warfare of disinformation, propaganda, corruption, refugees, and a general sense of chaos. In Ukraine, we have been stunned by the inability of countries and multilateral institutions to react strongly, consistently, and effectively to the war in our country. And even the fear to name Russia as not just a party to the conflict, but also the prime driver behind it. And indeed, over the past decade, we're seeing growing divisions, polarization, spineless leadership, and policies devoid of principles and values. So we must ask, are existing institutions able or unable to respond to current crises? Can we reinvigorate them, or do we need to replace them with new and better institutions? Will new rising powers support or abandon these multilateral efforts? Will we see more regional cooperation instead of multilateral? And unfortunately, we have shown ourselves unable to predict crises, to regulate them, to resolve them, and to deal with their ramifications. Are we able to foresee future potential crises, such as, for example, some saying that Africa might be the next global hotspot for terrorism? Will there be conflict in the South China Sea or in the Baltic countries, in the Black Sea, or in Belarus, Ukraine, or the Baltic countries? And even in the United States, there was a study done 3 or 4 days ago by the University of Virginia that said that 52% of Trump supporters and 41% of Biden supporters either strongly or somewhat agree that it's time to split the country. So when you have a country that served as a role model for freedom and justice around the world for many countries, now in itself in a state of crisis, it makes you question the world order. Today, we have an excellent panel of experts who will address these questions and others. And so I'd like to begin. And we will start with Her Excellency President Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović from Croatia.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Yushchenko. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. And I thank you all for organizing this very pertinent conference and in particular this panel on peace and security in a changing world. I will address briefly as the first person on this panel, the problems that we are facing in today's world, and I will address the potential for the solution. So it is true that our world is getting increasingly complicated, that we're living in an increasingly complicated international environment that is changing at an ever increasing speed. We see tectonic geopolitical shifts and the rise of new world order, most notably the shift of power towards the East. We see that this world order is characterized by asymmetry of issues, asymmetry of problems, and the instability of these issues. We see a proliferation of actors at all levels, ranging from state actors, traditional state actors, but also suprastate actors and groups, international groups. We see even individuals as actors in international relations today, and in particular empowered by modern technologies and modern communications. All of these actors compete for geopolitical space, for influence and power through diplomatic, political, economic, and military means. And in terms of the security challenges that are posed to us today, in addition to the emergence of traditional military threats and reemergence of conflict, we see further proliferation of what we used to call new security threats or transborder threats, and that have in fact become traditional and very much the characteristic of the 21st century, such as the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, but also proliferation of other types of weapons, rise in extremism, in terrorism, in inequality and unequitable access to resources, lack of access to education, both academic and social education, lack of education to healthcare, then fragility, failed or failing states, climate change, extreme weather events, etc. In addition to this, we have seen huge and accelerated technological revolution, which is bringing about both opportunities and challenges. Without the technological revolution, the COVID-19 crisis would be even worse and would have more disastrous consequences, in particular for economic development. But it has also underlined the challenges of today's world that are reflected in an increasing socioeconomic divides that go within societies, but also among societies. We have seen, due to technological development, emergence of new types of weapons and of warfare, of artificial weapons based on artificial intelligence, and all this leading to cyber warfare, but also hybrid warfare, and what some have started to call hyper warfare as well. As I've said, the communication revolution has brought about its challenges as well. On the one hand, it has really democratized the space for communications, but it has also created opportunities for misuse and abuse of the public space, for misinformation, disinformation, malicious intent, etc. And in all this, individuals and groups are organizing into entities in the virtual space that spread extremist ideas and ideologies, that also sometimes teach people how to create weapons or even perform organized attacks. They fight science and progress, as we have seen in this malicious intent towards vaccination and curtailing the pandemic based on scientific research. And this all results in migrations within societies, within countries, but also international, in particular, illegal and uncontrolled migrations. And what is particularly dangerous is erosion of values. Values that are based on universal human rights and universal principles and the principles of democratic systems. And what we see in societies is distrust in governments, but also distrust in institutions, in systems and democracy itself. And again, rise in extremism, nationalism, populism, and search for alternative solutions both on the national and international scene, which are not always based not only on the existing systems and solutions, but which are not always based on the good intent of resolving the problems, but rather exacerbating them. As a result of this, we see deeply polarized societies, but also polarization in international relations. We see multilateralism that is under threat, and different kind of organizations. So in looking at the solutions that we must search, first of all, is creating frameworks of trust within and among societies, and restoring such values as solidarity, again, on the internal scene within societies, but also among societies. This is best seen in what we have discussed much today already, and that is response to COVID pandemic. We must fight any COVID nationalism or vaccine nationalism refuted by simple facts that in today's world, no nation, no country can isolate, no society can isolate themselves from what happens on the international scene. And lack of vaccination in any part of the world reflects back on our societies, not only in new variants of mutations of the virus, but also in economic terms on our own growth and prosperity. Secondly, harnessing the digital and the technological development of the 21st century is a must in order to benefit the humankind. And a human-centered future in all this will truly be a challenge. We need to harness these technologies in order to prevent the challenges that I've noted that arise from misuse of the artificial intelligence and other technologies to create new types of warfare and malicious intent towards societies and individuals. And we need to create some kind of agreements, and many people even talk about world governance, world digital governance, in order to regulate the digital space, but also to put the new technologies for the benefit of the humankind and not to become more detrimental and to exacerbate the existing threats. Now, all of this, of course, is put into the issue of multilateralism. We have for years now been trying to reform the United Nations system. And the Security Council is not the only problem or the only challenge. We often talk about the power of veto and the restriction of it to the P5. However, the reality is that without the power of veto, it is really questionable whether the big powers would be part of the United Nations. And our ultimate goal must be cooperation, finding compromises, and finding solutions that would benefit all. And as we know, compromise is an element that that does not always bring satisfaction to all sides. Nevertheless, it is very necessary. In searching for these solutions in the UN context, we have also talked a lot about regionalization and regional mechanisms. For the past years, they have been on the decline, I would say. However, when it comes to support for cooperative regional orders, I see them as a step towards a more uniform world order. And I think that a regional cooperation within regional frameworks is very much welcome in order to look at, in particular, local and regional conflicts, to understand them, to understand the underlying factors, and to be able to bring about solutions and to remove the root causes of conflict, without which we will see this conflict perpetualized. And thirdly, what we have seen in the recent years is the rise of so-called plurilateralism, or the coalitions of the willing, when nations get together and organize themselves in searching for solutions that that official or recognized multilateral institutions or organizations cannot deliver. In my opinion, this will be a mechanism of ad hoc coalitions that more countries will continue to resort to. And I do not see any danger in countries organizing themselves to find solutions to particular problems, even to regulate them, as long as they're within the framework of the existing global and regional arrangements and the legislation that we all have adhered to, in particular with respect to human rights, universal human rights, and particular human rights in protecting minorities in all groups of our societies. So there are many challenges ahead of us. However, we do have the power and the capacity to start resolving them. I believe that the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us many lessons, and we need to employ these lessons learned in the weeks and months ahead in order to spur multilateralism and multilateral cooperation, which again is the only solution to any of the particular problems that our countries might be experiencing in the globalized, interconnected, or re-globalized world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are we ready to turn on the microphone for Amre Moussa, Secretary General of the League of Arab States?
Hello. Hello.
You?
Hello. Hello, Kateryna. How are you?
Good. It's a pleasure to see you this morning.
Thank you very much. Do I have the floor?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, dear moderator. And I wish to start by thanking our co-chairman and the Secretary General of the Nizami Janjaweed International Center for this initiative of calling for yet another debate of the issues pertaining to the future of the world under the title Peace, Diversity, and Common Humanity. And I'm also very glad to have the UN as our partner, since after all, without the UN, the world would have gone in a different direction, more dangerous than where we are. Let me start by stating that I agree with what President Kolinda Grabar has just said, with her statement, with her arguments, but I wish to add the following. Number one, yes, there is an erosion of values and change of the mood in world societies. But this change of the mood and erosion of values has started well before COVID. And it was one of the weak points in the system, the multilateral system of the 20th century. It has created a situation of mistrust between countries, societies, and the people, and their view of the superpowers and their behavior. Of course, the 21st century is not and should not repeat the mistakes of the 20th century. And here I bring to the discussion the title of this panel, which is Peace and Security in a Changing World. And the question, are we going to deal with the term security in the same meaning, in the same framework as we have been dealt with it in the 20th century? So it is invasion, foreign occupation, violation of sovereignty, territorial integrity, etc. Or we are going to introduce a new definition in harmony with what we are facing in the 21st century, meaning in particular, adding the pandemics, adding the climate change challenges, and reaffirming the dangers of certain basic items that were the essence of friction in the world and continue to build a lot of tension in the four corners of our world. meaning, for example, the clash of civilizations. And the clash of civilizations indeed exists. It is there. There is no point in denying it. And therefore, should we add those points, I mean, pandemic, climate change, clash of civilizations, and I believe also the situation, women's situation in the world, the children abuse, and I cannot mention such important points without mentioning poverty. That is engulfing most of the countries of the world. So lack of education, as has been stressed by many speakers in the opening session and by the first speaker of this session. So the term security will have to be reaffirmed, reframed. All those issues will have to come under this title, threats to international peace and security. And therefore, the UN should stress this point. And I believe the Secretary General of the UN has just done that. He stressed the two first points, which is pandemics and climate change as new threats to international peace and security. I believe that the term security has changed. And therefore, to discuss the point of peace and security in a changing world, we'll have to address some redefinitions of what we are talking about. I suggested in interventions with some think tanks during the COVID high attack that we must introduce some change. We have to take the initiative to suggest something new. So if the Secretary General was talking about the pandemic and the climate change as new threats to international peace and security, we have to raise the issue of veto. Why don't we ask? Why don't we work? Why don't we appeal to the veto powers in the Security Council to come to a gentleman agreement among them that issues pertaining to climate change or pandemics as threats to peace and security should not be subject to veto? We cannot impose that on them, but we have to call on them that we have to do something concrete in order for the people to feel that, yes, indeed, there is something new, that the new international system, that the new multilateral system will accept changes that would be in favor of the general security of the people around the world. That is one point. The second point, are we in a position to really put into effect a plan to renovate, to change positively the international system, the multilateral system? Can we do that? A question was raised. Either we renovate or we abolish and build another thing, another multilateral system. The second suggestion is impossible. We cannot start from scratch. We will have to deal with the UN and renovate the UN, introduce real change into the UN system, like the one I'm just suggesting. We should appeal for the big powers in the Security Council not to use the veto when we discuss issues pertaining to international the climate change or the pandemics. Let them use the veto in the rest of issues, but not this one. This is something we can do. We can debate. We can even formulate the suggestion or the proposal and adopt it, all of us, in the international civil society. I must remind you that what adversely affected the multilateral system until now is the policies of double standard, the policies of managing the crisis, the problems, rather than solving them. This is what contributed to the erosion of values, as Kolinda was just saying. We have not found one solution for one problem that was put on the agenda of the Security Council. True, the problem with the multilateral system is not only the Security Council, but it goes everywhere in the system, to the General Assembly, that has also to change, to consider, to debate how to change and bring back effectiveness to the General Assembly, but also with specialized agencies. I must say that specialized agencies have succeeded, where this success story of the United Nations, but they cannot stay as they were in the 40s, 50s, 60s, etc. They have to be subject for renovation, to build on the good things that they have done and the effective performance that they have shown during the last 70 years. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let us call a spade spade. The world is going in the direction of a new Cold War. Yes, the competition or the confrontation, or let me say relations between America and China, between the US and China, were heading towards a certain kind of competition in trading, investment, other issues of that kind, important things. But now we see the policies of containment are coming back. You remember containment? The Cold War, the beginning of the Cold War in the 40s and 50s. Again, we are in this stage. So the more we change, the more we remain the same. This would behoove us to discuss honestly and openly what we are witnessing of points that will affect any movement to the future. If we are facing the possibilities of a new Cold War, so we have to think how to face it. I believe, and I believe many do agree with me about the idea of neutrality among them. Not just a passive neutrality, but powers, neutral. We have to go and say, mention, stress that we cannot accept the emergence of another Cold War. This will destroy the future of the world. We have so many problems that threatens humanity, human being, the earth, that are more important than following this or that power in their emerging Cold War. I have the idea and come from the third world, and I have been for long in the UN and the global system. I believe that an idea similar to the non-alignment should be discussed. But this time, with the participation of Europe, with the participation of Russia, with the participation of all those who really care for a future that will not bring back the same situation of another Cold War that we have seen in the 20th century. 21st century requires a different approach. And part of this different approach that we have to be clear. We have to speak our minds. We have to say that business as usual, as we have seen in the 20th century, will not work. Then we have also to call on those experts amongst us to consider, what do we mean by multilateralism? What should we mean by multilateralism? What is when we compare multilateralism with globalization, is there interaction? Or there are two different ideas? How can we deal with all that? So I suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that we have to move from one station to the other. We have discussed, we have spoken a lot about this situation, what we need, our aspiration. Now, the time has come for concrete suggestions in order to be able to mobilize public opinion around such suggestions or proposals. Like the 2 or 3 points I've just raised, because of the shortness of time, I cannot elaborate even more. But in fact, if we start to discuss concrete steps and plans to mobilize public opinion behind those ideas, concrete steps, then we will be really making good for the item, this very basic item we are talking about, and the title of the subject we are debating, peace and security in a changing world. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much. May I now ask President Ivanić to take the floor.
Thank you very much, dear friends. This subject is extremely interesting, especially in these days. I really believe that this is so because after the withdrawal of the states from Afghanistan, I really believe that we have a new challenge. Serious challenge about the security around the world, because it's very clear that the power which had right before to intervene whenever they believe that the human rights or security of the United States was in a trouble. My perception after seeing this withdrawal is that America will not intervene in the future, at least in the next decade, as long as not direct, but very clearly direct interest, which means what's then with the issues of the human rights around the world, which means who will intervene in military conflicts, which are so many potentially there, and especially with the countries where you have internal difficulties, movements trying to separate from the countries. And we can mention a lot of examples, including my country, Bosnia. We can have a Transnistria, we can speak about the Nagorno-Karabakh, we can speak about so many different places. So what is the answer? Do we know, even on the horizon, what is the answer for all these challenges? I think that we don't have that answer at these days, and that we all need this answer. Example of Bosnia and Herzegovina. That was a very difficult war with a lot of problems, and today Bosnia is a peaceful country. Far from being perfect, but peaceful without the conflicts and functioning. And then the question is, why? There were three key preconditions. First one, the parties involved in conflicts were tired and ready for the compromise. Second one is solution was in between two extreme potential solutions. And third, and for me, the most important fact, that the big powers were on the same side. I think that this is the last case, as I remember, when the Russia, states, EU, Organization of Islamic countries were on the same side, all of the same side. Without that precondition, without some sort of the agreement of the big powers, there is no real solution, sustainable solution on the ground. As long as the big powers have favorites, there is the end of the conflict. It's very difficult to expect that. And now by having withdrawal of the United States to be a key player, which in reality, it was the case in last decade, trying to be now self-isolated from all these potential conflict. The only institution which I see who can play some sort of the role is UN. But UN until now is seen like extremely inefficient. Long discussions, big blah, blah, blah statements, a lot of nice diplomatic wording without the essence. Does it mean if that will continue that we will be so, let's say, that we will accept conflicts like reality, like something which is a normal? Does it mean that in the future, without having institutions dealing with that, we can be just, it can be normal for us to see dictatorships all over the, because if the dictators will see that there is no power who is ready to intervene because of the human rights, we can expect increase of the dictators all over the world. If the first is again, stability before the human rights, we will see so many different worlds that we cannot even imagine that. So what is the solution? I really believe that we have all, especially, let's say, small countries, that we have to press the big powers to sit and finally honestly speak first among each other, and then to press them to use the UN system like the only way to do something and to apply the rules everywhere. This is extremely important. You know, if you see some of the cases, for instance, Nagorno-Karabakh, there was no involvement of these big institutions, and we just closed the eyes for so many years, which was basically a challenge for the unity of the country, of Azerbaijan. Even my country has, even these days, the same problem. And this double standard, I'll call it, Amre Moussa, is something which is not acceptable. We have to apply the same rules everywhere, and not to support our favorite side. Why this side is favorite, I don't know, but simply to apply the rule everywhere, in all the cases. And then if you apply that, then we will not have exceptional cases, which especially the big powers use for their own purposes, like Ossetia, like, I don't know, some others. In order to have that, the small countries, the developing countries have to press the big powers and really to ask them to sit honestly to speak. We have basically in reality, at least 4 of them, 2 military strong powers, US and Russia, 2 economically strong powers, which is again, US and China, and then 2 politically significant powers, especially for me, EU. And EU, by its definition, is multilateral. And because of that, has to be a leading power in having all these big powers together. So they have to be engine of that. Because without that, honestly speaking, the only future which I can see is ignorance of the problems. Just to keep them far from me without having any involvement in that, which is for the humanity, it's not the real choice. Thank you.
Thank you, President Ivanić. Now I'd like to turn the floor to Ambassador Thomas Greminger. He is the former Secretary General of the OSCE and now the Director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It's a great pleasure and an honor for me to take part in this discussion on peace and security in a changing world. Yes, the world has been changing, and it would be strange if it didn't. But what seems to be different today is the speed of change. Just look at the collapse of the international presence in Afghanistan, the spread of COVID, climate change. Coping with this velocity requires at least two things. One is better anticipation, and the second is closer cooperation. Let me address both of these points briefly. We are informed like never before. One reason why the world seems to be changing so quickly and dramatically is that technology enables us to know what is going on in most parts of the world, and usually in real time. We have also unprecedented data and tools to enable us to track flows of people, money, weather, goods. And big data allows us to analyze and to predict like never before. The problem, or at least one of the problems, is that short election cycles and even shorter news cycles mean that politicians and the media are focused on the issues of the day. So we are stuck in the present without learning from the past or preparing for the future. At the Geneva Center for Security Policy, where I'm the director, we carry out strategic forecasting, and we try to provide leaders and future leaders with the mindset, the skill set, and the tool set to anticipate and to understand risks and to cope more effectively with complex challenges. We clearly need more of this. Current and emerging challenges are too complex to be tackled by diplomats and politicians alone. We need to bring together people from different backgrounds to combine their knowledge. Diplomats, yes, of course, but also the private sector, civil society, youth, experts, to strike a creative spark to generate new ideas and more effective approaches, to focus on prevention and on sustainability rather than on reactive firefighting. My second point is on the need for cooperation. In a rapidly changing world where states are concerned about risks to their security, the tendency is to harden borders, to erect walls, and to seek national solutions. However, most current and emerging threats to security do not come from other states. They come from transnational threats, what Kofi Annan once called problems without passports. You cannot call out an airstrike against a virus. You cannot have a national solution to transnational organized crime or terrorism. You cannot close the drawbridge against climate change or a pandemic, even if you are a great power. Quite simply, transnational threats require multilateral responses. I'm therefore encouraged to read UN Secretary General Guterres' report on our common agenda. In an interconnected world, states must work together. And cooperation clearly is not altruism. Solidarity is self-interest. Developing and implementing a common agenda requires cooperative security. I know this term is seldom used and even less often defined. So allow me to explain briefly. Cooperative security is an approach for improving relations between states, both bilaterally and multilaterally. It is based on the premise that we need to have security with each other rather than security from each other. By its nature, cooperative security is a white tent that enables inclusive dialogue and joint action among a wide range of stakeholders. Through cooperative security, states can work together to the same end in a constructive, collaborative way. Instead of a zero-sum game, the outcome can be win-win. Cooperative security promotes consultation rather than confrontation, reassurance rather than deterrence, transparency rather than secrecy, and prevention rather than coercion. Therefore, cooperative security is well suited, I believe indeed essential, for a common agenda designed to deal with global challenges. Indeed, I believe it's the only way. Closer to home, I would argue that security in Europe will only be restored if Russia and the West can come up with a common agenda. You may say this is totally unrealistic, but look at how the United States and Russia, because of their differences and not despite of them, have agreed to a strategic stability dialogue here in Geneva as a follow-up to the June summit between the presidents Biden and Putin. The key is to follow up openings and opportunities by implementing confidence and security building measures, by identifying issues of common converging interest, and by promoting military-to-military dialogue. Clearly, cooperation does not just happen. It needs to be fostered. Therefore, process design is a key and often overlooked element of managing relations and sustaining peace. Ladies and gentlemen, one final thought. How do we develop a common agenda or promote cooperative security among states that do not share the same values or are not all democracies? Well, I guess we need to rediscover the art of dialogue, of constructive engagement, of agreeing what we can talk to each other respectively, even if we do not agree with each other. My center, the GCSP, and more broadly, Geneva, is a safe place for inclusive dialogue, even or perhaps especially among non-like-minded people or groups. And as Desmond Tutu said, and I quote him, if you want peace, don't talk to your friends, talk to your enemies, end of quote. In conclusion, working for peace and security in our rapidly changing world will require anticipation and it will require cooperation. If we are to achieve the SDGs, to slow climate change, and to end protracted conflicts, we'll need to talk to each other and to work together. As a species, our common agenda should be survival, and that clearly can only be achieved through cooperation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. And now I'd like to ask Dr. Alexander Likhotal, professor at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations, to take the floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here and to discuss this very important issue. I must apologize. I didn't know that we will be able to make presentations. I thought that it will be just a discussion. So I do not have any prepared statement. I will try to respond and discuss the issues at stake. It's extremely interesting what I've heard here because of course, the majority, practically all the people here in the panel have a deep knowledge, practical knowledge of what it is about. I mean, international relations, foreign policy, and they have pretty clear picture of how to respond and how to react to what is going on. I was particularly impressed by the contribution of my friend Amre Moussa, because he concentrated exactly on the issues of security. And I think that he has all reasons to claim that the security pattern today we use is absolutely out of sync with the current situation. The world seems to continue using the national security strategies, relying only on the national security strategies, and these strategies are remarkably unchanged since the World War II. And of course, they are not suited for more dynamic threats that we are facing today. Today, this summer of 21 was really some kind bear than apocalyptic taste because it seemed that, you know, the biblical horse riders, all of them descended on earth. Everything was burning. What could have been burned from, let me say, California to Siberia? Everything that could be flooded did flood. And in addition to coronavirus, in addition to continuing conflicts around the world. But I think that we are living in a totally different situation, and application of the previous patterns does not work. One very stark illustration to what extent it fails. Since 9/11, wars and various American anti-terrorism raids and military activity around the world have taken the lives of roughly 7,000 US troops and cost the federal government slightly, a little bit more than $6 trillion. And it took, well, 20 years, in fact, since that started. As bad as that is, in less than 5% of that time, the coronavirus pandemic has accounted for more than 100 times of human loss in the United States, reaching today practically over 700,000 casualties dead. Also costing the same $6 trillion, but all done in 5% of the time. And it seems that the 20th century political structures are drowning now in the 21st ocean of deregulated finance, artificial intelligence, autonomous technology, religious militancy, and in addition to that, the great power rivalry, again and in accelerating mode. I would say that it doesn't fit the picture because the world has changed dramatically. Today, I would say there are three points that qualify this change. One, the world has become much more inclusive. I hope that those who remember the Cold War period will agree with me that at that time, what was important in international relations? What was taking place between the Soviet Union and the United States and generally in Euro-Atlantic region? Everything else was totally marginal. It was periphery of the international relations. And today I think that the periphery has become the center of that. What we're talking today mostly, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Middle East, and that has become the old periphery has become the center, the focus of the modern international relations. Then, of course, the nature of the conflict has changed dramatically. We do remember that usually the conflict started because of the struggle between the powerful nations, countries. They competed with each other and power was the source of the conflict. Today, it seems that we have totally reverse situation. Today, the weakness has become the core of the conflictuality in the world, because I should simply remind you about the countries with weak statehood, with weak government, and all that, and of course the weak economy, all that becomes the core of the modern conflict, the reasons of the modern conflict. And finally, I would say the mobility, of course. And mobility not only in terms of, our ability to travel, I am saying that mobility covering all spectrum of things from information, goods, people, diseases, everything has become mobile and traveling. And I would say that today's circumstances call for an updated operational system. I would like to answer shortly to the other questions that were put on the agenda today, because I think that the approach to the crisis of the international relations and the global system reminds me of the babysitter approach. We usually jump and pay attention to where the most noise comes from, forgetting that whatever is happening today is a structural problem. And without the change and upgrading of the structure, this will not help simply. We will be jumping from one issue to another continuously without positive results. And here I come to the core of that. Maybe it will seem a little bit over-revolutionary, but in my judgment, one of the biggest problems rests in the situation that we're still hostages of the post-Westphalian system, when national sovereignty belongs only to the states, and the states are the only game changers and actors on the international arena, which is an obsolete picture. May I just remind you just quite a few examples. Just 4 years ago, the Danish government has established the position of a special ambassador, and it was called digital ambassador, ambassador not by any country, but by the corporations Apple, Google, and Microsoft. And Minister of Foreign Affairs of Denmark, speaking about this, explained simply the decisions of these corporations sometimes have much more impact on the foreign policy of Denmark than the decisions of many countries. That is happening. You know, these institutions, corporations that I mentioned, they have become the holders of the social, let me say, identity of the people. How do people socialize today? Facebook has now 3 billion citizens of Facebook. Over 3 billion, half of the world are members of the Facebook. That cannot be ignored. What is going on domestically in politics, we usually brush this aside. But remember Trump and Twitter story. Remember what is going today in Russia and Belarus, what was going in the Middle East during the Arab Spring. What role did they play? And I think to keep them isolated, corporations, is not smart anymore. They should become a recognized stakeholder in the international relations. Another examples, cities, regions in the world. Look at the pandemic. Who was successful in dealing with the COVID pandemic? Cities. In the United States, it was New York mayor and the city. Everywhere there were regions, and because it is more natural to work on these issues between the cities, they find solution much easier than between the nations. Here in Switzerland, during the apogee of the coronavirus pandemics, in France, the hospitals were oversaturated by the sick people. And they quickly, Lyon and Geneva has come to agreement, and the trains with the sick people were coming to Geneva Hospital, which had space there. And there are plenty of examples like that. So I think that we should be talking not about the reshuffling of the multilateralism system out of the bricks that have been available for the last 400 years, in fact, I mean, post-Westphalian system. But we should try to amend and update it, that it should be relevant to the modern system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Likhotal. Now I'd like to turn to Mr. Scott Weber, President of Interpeace, who's a specialist in peace building and conflict prevention.
Thank you, Ms. Yushchenko. Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and a special word, warm word of greeting to Dr. Amre Moussa, with whom I've had the pleasure of meeting and working, and for whom I have so much respect. The question of this panel, if I put it slightly differently, would be, is our system fit for purpose, especially in this changing world? And I think everyone on this panel and listening in would agree that it is not. The question is, what do we do about it? But I want to focus in on a couple factors just to highlight how the system is not working, and then talk about what we can do to perhaps adjust it. The first is that, and let's recall that most conflicts, certainly the conflicts that we deal with at Interpeace, an international organization for peace building, most conflicts have at their origin some form of exclusion, political, social, or economic exclusion, and a sense of injustice that breeds. Now, if you take the main focus of the United Nations system and the countries of this world, the Sustainable Development Goals, you can assess that the progress against the SDGs in the fragile states of this world, there are 57 fragile states, 1.8 billion people today, 2.3 billion by 2030, they are not achieving the SDGs. The Millennium Development Goals, if we recall, not one conflict country achieved one of the MDGs. And so we're on track for a similar disappointment with the SDGs, which means that a third of the planet is not getting access to the Sustainable Development Goals, be they health, sanitation, all sorts of issues. Now, what is the number one obstacle to the SDGs? It's conflict. Conflict, like with the MDGs, is the main obstacle to the SDGs. And yet, if we don't resolve conflict properly, which has as at its origin exclusion and a sense of injustice from that exclusion, we are creating a cycle of exclusion. Conflict is preventing the SDGs, the lack of the SDGs is creating more inequalities, and so on and so forth. So we have to examine, why are we not demonstrating a good track record at building sustainable peace in these societies and giving people the access to the opportunity of development? There are a number of reasons for that, but I want to say a word first, because we've heard a lot about the big power competition dominating our attention in global affairs today, which I understand, and we all know the legacy of the Cold War and certainly don't want it to return, even if it is returning in new ways. But let's remember too that most of the conflicts that we are dealing with are not internationalized conflicts. They are national or subnational conflicts. When the big powers get involved, it's often because there was that fragility within a society that they were able to exploit. Frankly, that is the same game plan that terrorists use. They look for countries or communities that are fragile, that are divided within themselves, and they go and exploit that fragility in order to take over. So if we want to be able to prevent the expansion of terrorism from taking root in the local level and becoming a national and international problem, if we want to avoid conflicts that start, as most of them do, as national or subnational problems from becoming internationalized and becoming a chessboard of the big powers, we have to focus on preventing those conflicts from escalating before they reach that point. So the answer becomes, when a conflict has been internationalized, of course you need the big powers to come together. But if we want to be serious, like Ambassador Greminger said about prevention, we have to go back to the source and understand why these conflicts are happening in the first place, that are generating that fragility that makes them vulnerable to international involvement. Now, why are Why is the UN ill-equipped to deal with that? We know that the UN was extremely successful. It's an amazing success story at preventing international conflict. The drop in international conflicts since the creation of the UN is dramatic. What it has not been successful at doing is dealing with that phenomenon of internal conflict that I was discussing earlier, of civil wars with non-state actors who don't dress in suits and ties like we do and sit across a table to negotiate. The UN is not equipped to deal with that form of conflict. And thus, that is the form of conflict that has dominated the last 30 to 40 years. Now, we also know the track record of international peacemaking is very poor. 60% of peace agreements fall apart within 5 years and 80% within 10. So we have a problem. We know how to stop the shooting, but do we know how to really build sustainable, legitimate, and long-term peace in society? The answer is no, at least certainly from the outside. Now, we've been examining the reasons why international peacemaking has been so unsuccessful over the last years. And we've identified 7 key factors that I'll quickly run through that we can cite at the origin of that problem. The first is that most peace processes are focused on what we call negative peace, not positive peace. Negative peace is stopping the fighting. We know that peace is not just the absence of violence. And yet most peace processes are focused on that, on stopping the fighting, not positive peace, which is building legitimate institutions in society, a social contract between the citizens and the state, and between citizens and different groups in society. The second strategic error of international peacemaking is that these processes tend to be elite-driven and outside-driven. When we know that for peace to be sustainable, it has to come from within society, not from the outside. And yet we continuously impose or import solutions from one place to another in artificial ways. The third is that we have conflated and confused in peace processes with mediation, as if mediation, which is a very concentrated moment and a very important moment in the larger peacemaking equation, as if that is the peace process, and it is not. We need to reframe, to use the ambassador's term, we need to reframe peace processes to look at them in a 20-year perspective. Afghanistan, one of the problems of the US government of Afghanistan and the government of Afghanistan is that they didn't have a 20-year strategy, they had 21-year strategies. So how do we reframe these processes to be the intergenerational processes of building sustainable peace that we know they need to be, and look at how they operate at multiple levels, not just at the elite track 1 level. And so stop being so focused on the negotiating table and start looking at the process, like the ambassador said earlier. 4 is that even when we do come to a peace agreement, we don't implement them. 2/3 of peace agreements are not implemented at all. And of the rest that are left, about half are left to die a slow death of neglect. And there are many recent cases, including in Latin America, that you will all understand as an example of that. 5 is that we have so professionalized our sector that we throw tools at a society, DDR, disarmament and demobilization, reintegration, or a reconciliation commission because it worked in South Africa, maybe it'll work here, rather than putting the context first and the culture first and understanding what's relevant to them in terms of where they are, the timing of their society's path towards peace, and making sure that we root everything in the society's culture and timing. 6 is that we don't look at who benefits enough from the war, i.e. the war economy, and who can benefit from the peace. And 7, we don't go far back enough into the history to understand what led in a structural way to the conflict. Most peace processes focus on the immediate fighting that we just had, not the historical reasons that led to that in the first place. So these are just 7 of the many reasons why international peacemaking needs to be completely rethought. And as a result of that, and not to sit on our hands and just complain, we took the initiative to launch an International Commission on Inclusive Peace that has a 2-year mandate to rethink the norms and standards for how peace processes should be designed, implemented, and monitored over time. And it has eminent people from the international system, including Geneva's own Yves Dacour, the former Director General of the ICRC, Bert Koenders, the former Foreign Minister of Netherlands, but also civil society actors like Ilwa Delman from Somalia and others. And this commission is precisely trying to come up with new rules for the game. We have Geneva Conventions to govern our behavior during wartime, but we don't have similar standards and norms for how we should behave in building peace. And yet, if we don't get this right, it can set a society off on the wrong path for 20 to 30 years. So what are the standards that should govern that decision-making? How do we avoid those traps that I mentioned, those 7 traps, and not repeat the same mistake again and again and again? Many societies in which we work tell us that they feel like they're the victims of the peace process that was done to them. Certainly not with them and certainly not for them, that was done to them. So this can no longer stand. If conflict is the main obstacle to the SDGs, and we're poor at overcoming conflict, we have to get serious about this and overcome this. And it's not just a political matter. We believe very strongly that you can pursue peace through all the other SDGs. SDG 16 is not a standalone SDG. You can pursue peace in the way that you do your food security work, if it brings communities closer together and creates a stronger bond between the state and society, et cetera. All the SDGs are opportunities to build peace, and we have to pursue it that way. So a couple of recommendations beyond the work that this commission will be doing for the next year and a half of their mandate, and I invite all of you to contribute. It's now become the largest collective effort in the peace space in my lifetime, with 120 organizations, many UN agencies involved, and hundreds of thousands of citizens around the world who are contributing their voice to this process. But just a couple last points. One is that we have to also remember that conflict remains the exception, not the rule. It is the exception. And so when you look at a society or a region or a continent, we should stop labeling it as fragile and focus, like the ambassador said, on the squeaky wheel gets the oil. The most flashy parts get all the attention, because we need to be focused not just on fragility, but on resilience. It's the Somalis who taught us this lesson. They asked us at one point, why are you so focused on the parts of Somalia that are burning? Why don't you focus on the parts that aren't burning and understand why they're not burning? Why did Somalis find solutions to the problems that they had without international assistance? And that's what led us to do not just conflict mapping, but peace mapping, resilience mapping. When you do resilience mapping and you use the other part of your brain, what you realize is that there's so much more stability there than we would normally recognize. And that we on the outside are not necessarily the solution. The solutions actually already exist in societies. It's a question of harnessing those and taking them to scale. But no country wants to be labeled as fragile. So if you go in with like the World Bank's fragility, conflict, and violence strategy into a country, they'll send you packing. If you come in and talk to them about their sources of resilience and how they can strengthen and enhance that resilience, even if it's weak, you will partner with all actors, including governments. So taking a resilience approach versus a fragility approach is something that we need to do, and that helps us to rethink aid so that it's not aid, it's actually investing in the resilience of societies. And we need institutions, and that's the final point. We need to recognize that even as Amre Moussa rightly said, that the specialized agencies have been one of the success stories of the UN system. That's true, but that they need to change too. But we need a different kind of institution in the future. We need institutions that are much more reflective of the diversity of our world, like the ambassador was saying, that are reflective of the different stakeholders, not just governments, that have demands and that have a voice and that have agency, that can create change. Change is not created by states anymore. It's created by society, and then states tend to catch up if they're lucky. Well, we need institutions that reflect that, and I believe that the solutions to many of the issues that we deal with, as complex as they are found between sectors, not in any one sector. And yet our world, and Geneva as a city, is very siloed. So we need cross-silo organizations, networked institutions that are designed for purpose, maybe dissolve again, but that link up the various knowledge bases of our system for a common purpose. The common agenda, like the Secretary General was talking about, requires that cross-sectoral engagement, and we need to incentivize that cross-sectoral cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Wafaa Saeed Abdelatef, who is the Director of the Coordination Division of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs.
Okay, thank you so much, Ms. Yushchenko, and distinguished panel members and the ladies and gentlemen here. I'm going to talk about 3 points. I think Mr. Weber spoke about that conflict is the obstacle to achieving the SDGs. So I'm going to share with you some statistics about the impact of conflict on civilians as we speak. I'm going also to reflect briefly on the role of multilateralism and humanitarian action, specifically about international humanitarian law. And I'm also going to conclude by 3 key asks and priorities of the multilateral system have to deliver on, given the scale of the complexity and the suffering that we are seeing. And I think so maybe I want to start that in 2020, we had the pandemic, and in spite of repeated calls for global ceasefire to focus on a global response to the pandemic, 2020 has seen continuation of conflicts worldwide. And humanitarian access and operation were hampered by conflict, insecurity, violence against aid workers, bureaucratic impediments, and also by counterterrorism and sanctions. And in 2020, we had 169 security incidents against humanitarian workers in 19 states affected by conflict, and that resulted in the deaths of 99 humanitarian workers. It's lower than the year before, but it is really a horrific figure. Conflict also remained the key driver of food insecurity in 2020. We have 155 million people in 55 countries who are facing what we call crisis level food insecurity or worse. And we have around 500,000, or rather more than 500,000 people who are experiencing famine-like conditions. We are in the 21st century and people are experiencing famine-like conditions in Ethiopia, in Madagascar, in South Sudan, and in Yemen. And we have over 41 million people who are facing also famine and famine-like conditions if they don't receive immediate life-saving assistance. And the Secretary General in March of this year has established a high-level task force on preventing famine to bring coordinated messaging and action. And part of that also is to provide access to be able to reach these people who are in very desperate situation. I think also conflict continues to have this feature of sexual violence against women and girls. And in many places, still, survivors and victims face persistent social, structural, and security constraints, often leading to negative coping mechanisms, including, for example, early and forced marriage, which we have seen increasing now during the pandemic. And also I want to flag that 5 years after the adoption of Resolution 2286 on the protection of medical care in armed conflict, attacks against health workers have increased in 2020. WHO recorded the killing of 182 healthcare workers in 22 countries affected by armed conflict. And this is at the time of the pandemic and where we really need increase in the health response. And the highest numbers were recorded in Burkina Faso, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, and in the Syrian Arab Republic. The last point I want to flag in terms of dimension of conflict is a number of people who are displaced within their countries. People have been displaced multiple times. And it has reached a record as at the end of last year, we have 55 million people have been internally displaced. Of these, around 85% have been displaced because of conflict. And the Secretary General called, as I mentioned earlier, for this global ceasefire to unite against the virus, but conflict continued unabated, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East, and in North Africa. And the persistent conflict continued to force people to flee in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, Afghanistan, while also escalating violence in Ethiopia, Mozambique, and Burkina Faso have also seen some of the largest growing displacement. And I have always, wherever I go, I think for people, for them to leave, I think it is the last thing that they want to do. They only leave when they have no other options. I think coming to multilateralism and humanitarian action, I think an example that multilateralism can work is the universally ratified Geneva Convention, because the convention is a multilateral consensus that civilians should be spared the impact of conflict. So I think this is something is actually quite core that we have this universal ratification of the Geneva Convention. And I think also to have respect for international humanitarian law multilateralism is very, very important. I think there was a discussion that now we are seeing conflict within states, but so the parties to the conflict have to respect international law, but also those who have influence over them should also engage on respect of international humanitarian law. And I think maybe another example of how the multilateralism has been coming to support other, protections is that following the Secretary General appeal for global ceasefire in March 2020, the Security Council passed a resolution in February 2021 calling on all member states to support sustained humanitarian pause to local conflicts in order to allow the COVID-19 vaccination and to also investigate these issues. I think maybe also another point that we really have the whole multilateral system has to come about is the respect of humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, and also operational independence. And I think this is something very important because on that basis, the humanitarian actors were able to stay and to deliver as we speak now in Afghanistan. But you know what, having this said, I think, and I'll give you the figures about the impact of conflict on humanitarian workers, on needs that have come to the risk of famine, on the impact of sexual violence on girls and women. I think there are three key things from the humanitarian perspective that we really need to see step up. We need to see a step up in diplomacy. And I think many colleagues spoke about widening the partnership. For example, I believe in a situation now that in Ethiopia, really the engagement of actors has to be also with I think one of the questions about regional organizations, so it have to engage the African Union, the IGAD, the academia, the civil society, the activists, the journalists. I think that's what the kind of diplomacy that really have to expand to this very wide and diverse actors so that to really maximize action and to have respect for IHL. I think also the other thing is that there should be, there was discussion about some things and some agreements don't get implemented. That's why the issue, for example, for me, accountability is very important. And I think also, since there is many resolution talks about protection of aid workers, we really have to have in place investigation and accountability mechanism. Of course, the national states are responsible, but also the system, when this is not happening, when they are unwilling or unable, there should be in place mechanisms for investigation and for accountability for aid workers. And lastly, I think also in the beginning, people spoke about education, about health, about reframing the security threats and the pandemic. The pandemic actually, in a way, has exposed the fragility of the system, especially in the health system in many places. And that's why I think now in situation of conflict, there should be a renewed recall for protection of schools and for health facilities and for health workers. And I mentioned that very horrific starking figure of the health worker they have been killed during the pandemic. Maybe my last point is that also multilateralism is very critical to address the underlying causes that bring conflict. I think now in many places we're seeing conflict in, just to give an example, and I think Mr. Weber, you've given an example in Somalia, and definitely Somalia is showing hope and resilience, but we still have some protracted needs because of conflict for more than 20 years in countries like Sudan, Somalia, and the DRC. So we really have to also invest, because humanitarian response is not the solution. The solution is to address the underlying causes of conflict. And I think there has been from the panel very practical examples. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
And thank you. I would like to ask Ilaha, have there been any questions through the chat? No, nothing. Then we actually have only a few minutes left, and I'd like to ask whether any of the panelists would like to follow up with any other thoughts. No? No? Then allow me to thank you for some very, very interesting, insightful, thought-provoking remarks. And I hope that we can continue this discussion during our other panels and also during our lunches and dinners. And hopefully not just discuss them, but actually come to some ideas and projects on how we can work together. Thank you.